Hey guys, tonight we begin with the elegant, disciplined, and often brutally unforgiving world of feudal Japan, a place of samurai honor, strict codes, and very sharp consequences. It's the land of cherry blossoms, beautiful poetry, and a daily routine that would absolutely break most of us by lunchtime. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In feudal Japan, you don't wake up and choose your path. You wake up and it's already been chosen, by birth, by blood, and by people who've been dead for 6 generations. Your role in society isn't a suggestion, it's a life sentence. Were you born into a samurai family? Lucky you. You're now responsible for the blade, the bow, and 10,000 ways to sit properly in front of your lord, born a peasant. Congratulations, you'll be spending the next 40 years ankle deep in mud, and your children will too forever. There is no resume. There is no start your own business. You're either a samurai, peasant, artisan, or merchant. And once you're placed, you stay there. Trying to jump ranks isn't just frowned upon, it's punishable. You don't climb the ladder in feudal Japan, you bow to it. And we haven't even gotten to the ETA, the untouchables. These are the people who deal with death. Butchers, executioners, leather workers. Society needs them but pretends they don't exist. They're like ghosts with jobs. Important jobs, but ghosts. Even within classes, it gets worse. Let's say you're a merchant, which sounds decent, right? You've got coin. But in feudal Japan, you're near the bottom. Why? Because you make money without labor, which is considered morally shady. Yes, you're literally too efficient to be respected. Meanwhile, the peasants are taxed so hard on their rice that if they cough up too much, they starve. If they hide some to survive, that's treason. Heads roll often. Samurai, you've got honor, but you're living in constant fear of disrespecting your lord, your ancestors, your tailor, or your sword by accidentally sneezing at the wrong time. Women, you didn't even ask. But no, you're not getting out of this, either. Whatever your class is, your freedom ends where your father's opinion begins. You'll marry who you're told, obey whom you must, and thank the heavens if you're allowed to learn poetry. So yes, you're born assigned a costume and a script and shoved onto the stage of society whether you want to perform or not. It's elegant, poetic, and crushingly inescapable. And that's all before you've had breakfast. You might think feudal, life was all grit and grime, but Japan took cleanliness seriously, painfully seriously. In fact, it was practically a religion, which sounds lovely until you experience it in winter. You begin your day by washing, not in a cozy tiled bathroom with a warm towel and cucumber soap, but at a stone basin filled with ice-cold water fetched from a well or stream. There's no heating, there's no negotiating. You splash your face and arms shivering as if the ancestors are punishing you for having pores. Soap only if you're rich. And even then, it's made from ash or rice bran and smells like something a monk invented as a test of character. In rural areas, the local bathhouse, if you're lucky enough to have one, becomes the heart of hygiene. The communal centre is heated by firewood and filled with villages. And by communal, we mean absolutely no privacy whatsoever. You bathe next to your neighbours, boss, future in-laws, and maybe your landlord, completely naked in silence, pretending this isn't awkward. You scrub first, then soak. Cleanliness is sacred. Dirtying the bathwater, social suicide. But if you're not near a bathhouse, then you wash what you can when you can. You clean your teeth with salt or a twig. Your nails are kept neat. Your hand clothes are regularly aired. You do this not because it's trendy, but because being unclean is seen as shameful spiritually and socially. And if you're a samurai, multiply the pressure. Your lord might inspect you head to toe at any time. Dirty fingernails, dishonor, wrinkled robe, disrespect, too much body odor during a bow, you might not get back up again. Women expected to smell, like cherry blossoms, and discipline. Bathing is ritualized, skincare is practiced with military precision, and hair is maintained in elaborate styles that take hours. Also, you can work a rice mortar and still look dignified doing it. So yes, feudal Japan was clean, very clean, but it came at a price: freezing water, endless grooming, and the constant soul-shrinking awareness that someone was definitely judging your foot hygiene. Let's say you're born into the warrior class, the samurai. Sounds cool, right? Fancy swords, silk robes, poetic sword fights under cherry blossoms. Now let's talk about the fine print. Being a samurai in feudal Japan isn't about swinging a katana and shouting for honor. It's about never ever screwing up. The entire framework of your life is governed by Bushido, the way of the warrior. A code of conduct so strict, even your ancestors are nervous. You don't live for yourself. You live for your daimyo, your lord. His word is law. His moods are weather patterns. And your job is to serve him with such loyalty that you'd rather die horribly than disappoint him mildly. No pressure. Disobedience. Dishonor. Failure. Dishonor. Raising your voice inappropriately. Dishonor. Looking at the wrong person sideways during a tea ceremony. You guessed it. Dishonor. And dishonor isn't something you walk off. It's something you're expected to atone, for usually with your own intestines. That's not a metaphor. That's seppuku, the ritual suicide. Expected of disgraced samurai. You kneel, pull out a short blade, and let's stop there. You get the idea. This wasn't rare. It was a respected, even celebrated way to preserve dignity. Mess up badly enough, and your lord might give you a short blade and a quiet room and say, "You know what to do." On top of that, samurai were expected to train constantly. Swordsmanship, archery, horseback riding, strategy, calligraphy, poetry, all while maintaining perfect posture and the expression of a man who's never known joy, just a deep sense of obligation. Laughing too loud, unrefined, showing fear, weakness, getting emotional, shameful. Your clothes are precise, your sword must be spotless, and your conduct must be so honorable it makes other people uncomfortable. And if you ever raise your sword, in anger without cause, insult a superior, or lose a duel, you don't just lose, you lose everything. Being a samurai isn't about glory. It's about discipline, silence, and surviving each day without blinking wrong. So yes, you look good in armor, but you're one eyebrow twitch away from existential catastrophe. So you weren't born a samurai. No sword, no poetry, no chance of dramatic ritual disembowelment. That's the good news. The bad news, you're a peasant, which means your entire existence is a combination of dirt, sweat, back pain, and government-mandated rice delivery. You wake up with the sun, not because you're one with nature, but because the land tax doesn't pay itself. And also, you're thatched. It has no doors, no windows, and someone's goat just walked across your bed mat. Breakfast, if you're lucky, a bowl of rice porridge and a side of last week's pickled something. If you're unlucky, it's pretend you're not hungry with a splash of river water. Then it's off to the rice fields, which sound peaceful in travel documentaries, but are in reality mud pits designed to break your soul slowly over 12 hours. You plant, you weed, you hope a bandit raid doesn't happen today. And when the sun goes down, you limp home, only to discover that one of your oxmen is missing, and the village headman would like to speak with you about your grain shortfall. Taxes are relentless. You don't get paid in coins, you pay them with rice. Your family eats what's left, which isn't much, especially if the harvest was bad, or if your lord's nephew accidentally rode a horse through your plot during a military drill. Want to complain? That's adorable. You can't. Talking back gets you whipped, exiled, or promoted to corpse. If you're really lucky, you might become a village elder, which means people still don't listen to you, but now ask for your advice right, before ignoring it. And remember, you're legally not allowed to leave your village without permission. You are in effect a rice-based prisoner with seasonal ankle rot. Festivals, there are some. You get drunk on week's sake. Dance in a circle and try not to think about how planting season starts again in 4 days. So yes, you are the foundation of the economy, the reason the samurai eat, and the person everyone forgets exists. And no, you do not get a day off because feudal Japan believes in hard work, generational suffering, and keeping expectations extremely, extremely low. You're hungry. Of course you are. You've been tilling, planting, sweating, and politely not dying since sunrise. Time to eat. But in feudal Japan, meals aren't about indulgence. They're about survival, simplicity, and not choking on a fishbone in front of your in-laws. If you're a peasant, your diet is rice. Rice for breakfast, rice for lunch, rice for dinner. If you're lucky, it's actual rice. If you're not, it's barley, pretending to be rice. You might get a turnip or two, some pickled radish if the gods are in a good mood. Meat, that's for the daimyo, or for that one chicken that looked at you funny and mysteriously disappeared. Fish sometimes, but it's dried, salted, and sharp enough to file your teeth. Soup, usually miso if you can call hot salt water with 2 floating leaves soup. It's flavorful, yes, in the same way seawater is hydrating. Now, if you're a samurai, you do get better food, but you also eat last after your lord, his guests, and anyone he feels like impressing. That means cold rice, cold soup, and the eternal joy of watching other people eat while pretending you're deeply honored to wait. Also, everything is seasonal. Not because it's trendy, but because there's no refrigeration, no global supply chain, and if you don't harvest it yourself, it probably doesn't exist. So, when it's winter, that's just nature's way of suggesting fasting. And heaven forbid you get food poisoning. Medical care is optimistic. The local remedy is lie down and think about your ancestors. You'll either get better or become one of them. Food theft is a serious crime. Steal a bowl of rice and you're not getting a slap on the wrist. You're getting a public display of why we don't touch the daimyo's daikon. Tea. It's around, but not like you're imagining. The tea ceremony is a complex performance that's more about posture, etiquette, and existential humility than actually quenching thirst. So, yes, meals are sacred, quiet, and respectful. But mostly they're bland, small, and contain at least one crunchy mystery item. And no, you can't complain. Not unless you want your next meal served through your nose. So, you've just finished your modest bowl of crunchy maybe fish soup. Someone says something absurd. Maybe your lord mumbles a bad haiku. Maybe your village elder miscub. Maybe your neighbor insists his cow can predict the weather. And for one reckless, foolish moment, you think about correcting them. Don't. In feudal Japan, your opinion is a liability. Free speech is not a concept. It's a fast track to disgrace, exile, or sudden career-ending decapitation. The social hierarchy is rigid, and every word has a weight. Speak above your class, you're being imputed. Criticize someone above you, you're insolent. Make a joke that doesn't land, that's treason adjacent. Even within families, you tread carefully. A son doesn't interrupt his father. A wife doesn't correct her husband. And no one, absolutely no one, questions the daimyo, unless they've always wanted to explore the afterlife via sword tip. Samurai are trained to speak with measured calm, even when furious. A sharp tongue is worse than adult blade. It's unbecoming, it's dangerous, and it might force someone into the awkward position of having to kill you to restore their honor. Which brings us to apologies. In feudal Japan, apologies are an art form. You don't just say sorry, you bow, you grovel, you possibly write a poem about your shame. You might even send a gift like a live bird or a decorative comb while sincerely, hoping the person receiving it doesn't decide to duel you anyway. And gods help you if your tone is too casual. A misplaced word can be interpreted as sarcasm, defiance, or spiritual rot. Silence is almost always safer. Even humor is a tightrope walk. Laughing at the wrong thing could be seen as disrespect. Laughing with someone important might imply you think you're on their level. And that's how people end up mysteriously reassigned to the far north. So yes, you're free to speak technically, but in practice, you nod, smile, and pray your opinion never tries to escape your mouth. Because in feudal Japan, Loose lips don't just sink ships. They sink social standing, reputations, and sometimes your entire bloodline. In feudal Japan, fashion isn't about self-expression. It's about making sure everyone knows exactly how far below them you are, just by looking at your sleeves. Your clothing doesn't reflect your personality. It reflects your position, your purpose, and whether or not you're legally allowed to carry a sword without getting tackled by a samurai. Let's start at the top. Samurai wear layers of silk robes, sometimes armored, always dignified. Their outfits are carefully arranged to signal status and readiness. The colors, deep blues, earthy browns, and the occasional blood-red flourish, elegant, ominous, and almost always implying, "I have killed a man for less than a fashion faux pas." And of course, the swords, a samurai's daisho. The paired long and short swords is more than a weapon set. It's a walking badge of authority. Drawing one in public is a last resort. Wearing them improperly is a first step toward being publicly corrected with extreme sharpness. Peasants, on the other hand, wear cotton and humility. Brown, grey, and beige dominate your wardrobe. It's not because they're minimalists, it's because dyed fabric costs money, and you're too busy surviving to worry about coordinating hues. Your outfit says, "Yes, I work in mud. No, I didn't choose this lifestyle. Yes, these are my only sandals." Merchants wear finer materials. They have money after all, but they're still socially ranked below samurai and peasants, so they keep it muted. Rich, but not too rich. Silk, yes, but subdued. Wealthy merchant families are experts at looking just respectable enough not to get noticed by a bored samurai on patrol. Artisans and craftsmen dress neatly but modestly. Their clothing is durable, practical, and most importantly, unobtrusive. Drawing attention to yourself is considered a personality defect. And then there are women who must strike a delicate balance between grace, obedience, and wearing 12 of folded symbolism. Hairstyles are coded, kimono patterns are seasonal, and if you wear a color meant for a different festival, congratulations. You've just dishonored your entire household and possibly started a neighborhood whisper war. In short, what you wear isn't just about clothing, it's about rank, ritual, and surviving daily judgment from both heaven and your mother-in-law. So, you're imagining moonlit walks beneath cherry blossoms, whispered poetry under paper lanterns, perhaps a dramatic kiss between a samurai and a forbidden princess. Yeah, no. In feudal Japan, love is a side quest and not one you're likely to complete. Marriage isn't about feelings. It's about alliances, status, rice taxes, and not embarrassing your ancestors. If you're a peasant, your marriage is arranged by your parents and maybe the village elder. Romantic compatibility isn't discussed. Sturdy legs and healthy teeth are considered more important. If you're from a samurai family, the stakes are even higher. Marriages are tools of politics. Your partner is chosen to solidify a clan alliance, secure land, or pay off a grudge with a nice kimono. The goal isn't happiness, it's stability. Ideally, one that doesn't collapse during harvest season. Love letters maybe, but only if they're written in perfect calligraphy, using the appropriate seasonal metaphors, and passed along discreetly by a maid who definitely knows too much. Women, of course, have even less say. A samurai daughter may be married off at 15, required to master calligraphy, etiquette, needlework, and the fine art of never expressing disappointment out loud. Her job is to bear sons, serve tea, and absolutely never fall in love with the flute teacher. Actual romantic love, the kind with stolen glances and passionate declarations, is the domain of poets, theatre plays, and tragic ghost stories. If you want to experience love in feudal Japan, you'll need to watch a no-drama about two doomed lovers who turn into mist. And if you try to step outside your assigned relationship structure, good luck. Adultery can lead to exile, disgrace, or death by sword-related disapproval. The punishment might be carried out by your spouse, your lord, or your in-laws, whoever gets there first. Even for samurai, taking a concubine was common, but that didn't make things easier. It just added more people to disappoint, silently, So, yes, people fell in love secretly, painfully, occasionally with the wrong person, and always at the worst possible time. Because in feudal Japan, love wasn't forbidden. It was just dangerously inconvenient. In feudal Japan, death isn't a distant concept. It's your neighbor, your co-worker, your roommate who never pays rent, but is always around. You don't plan for retirement, you plan for your exit. Because death isn't a tragedy here. It's part of the script. Let's start with the samurai. These honorable warriors walk around with 2 swords and a personal death plan. If they lose a battle, seppuku, insult their honor. Seppuku, spill sake on the daimo's robe. Seppuku with dramatic background music. And it's not private. It's public, ceremonial, and performed with the same precision as a tea ceremony, but with significantly more internal bleeding. But don't think peasants are getting a longer life. If you're a farmer and the rice harvest fails, you're starving. If your village can't meet its tax quota, your head might be used to make a very stern point. Drought, plague, bandit raid. Pick your flavor of sudden demise. And good luck fighting any of it when your most advanced medicine is warm tea and a strong belief in herbal optimism. Speaking of bandits, they're real. They're everywhere. And they don't care that you spent all year growing those Dion radishes. The roads outside towns are so dangerous that people just don't travel unless absolutely necessary. The phrase "maybe we'll visit your cousin next year" actually means I enjoy being alive. If you're a woman, childbirth is a dice roll. Complications? Too bad. Midwives are helpful, but surgical options are mostly pray harder and boil another towel. If your husband dies in disgrace, you might be expected to follow him, not emotionally, but literally with a dagger. And let's not forget nature itself. Earthquakes, floods, tsunamis, famines. Japan is a disaster artist. Your home could be washed away or buried at any time. And the only insurance policy is a well-tied roof and deep spiritual acceptance. But, perhaps the darkest part, you're expected to accept it all calmly. Wailing in fear or fighting fate is considered undignified. A real hero bows before death, composes a poem, and meets their end like it's just another awkward dinner with your clan. So yes, feudal Japan is beautiful, but mortality is part of the decor. In modern life, you're told to follow your dreams, be your own person, and live your truth. In feudal Japan, your truth is whatever your clan tells you it is. Individualism isn't a virtue, it's a red flag. You exist not as a lone star of destiny, but as a very small branch on a very important family tree, and your job is to keep that tree from catching fire due to any embarrassing behavior, like expressing opinions or falling in love with a merchant's daughter. Your clan is everything. Your identity, your reputation, your future. It all flows through your family name. You are part of a web of obligations, honor, and expectations so dense it might as well be a spiritual spreadsheet. Even the samurai, proud, honorable warriors, don't fight for themselves. They fight for their daimyo, their household, their ancestors. And if they die, ideally, it's in a way that makes everyone above them look great. Because dying with honor is one thing, but dying in a way that slightly embarrasses your clan, that's the stuff of generational nightmares. Your actions reflect on your father. Your father's actions reflect on your grandfather. Your grandfather's actions may still be affecting how your cousin is treated in the next province over. It's not guilt by association. It's life by association. Want to open a noodle shop because you love cooking? That's adorable. Unfortunately, your clan raises horses, so you'll be brushing hooves until further notice. Express interest in painting? Excellent. You'll be decorating the temple your family sponsors with strict guidelines in total silence. And don't even think about scandal. One poorly timed affair, drunken incident, or public poem with too much sass, and the shame hits everyone. Your siblings shunned. Your mother mortified. Your great-uncle might have to disembowel himself just to restore the family's good standing. You are not a person. You are a representative, a chess piece, and a liability with legs. But hey, if you play your role well, bow at the right times, and marry who you're told, your clan might just speak your name with something resembling pride. And that's the feudal Japanese version of a personal achievement badge. Let's say you've survived the social hierarchy, the sword duels, the honor system, and the rice tax. Congratulations. Now try surviving the weather. Feudal Japan is a masterpiece of natural beauty. Snow-capped mountains, serene forests, blooming, cherry blossoms, and an absolute nightmare of environmental chaos. The scenery is gorgeous. The climate wants you dead. Start with typhoons. Massive storms that arrive like angry gods, bringing rain, wind, and the structural integrity of a rice paper wall. Roofs fly off, roads vanish. The rice you spent all season planting, floating gently downstream. Then there are earthquakes, sudden, violent, and completely unpredictable. There's no warning siren, no alert system. Just a faint rumble, a brief moment of existential confusion. And then your house is sideways. If you survive the shaking, you still have to worry about fires because everything is made of wood, including your bad decisions. Flooding is common. Too much rain and the rivers swell. Your village becomes a muddy soup bowl. Your crops drown. Your animals wander off. Your landlord still wants taxes, of course, now with interest. Droughts are just as cruel. Weeks of punishing sun and no rain leave the land cracked and the rice fields dry as a monk's humor. You pray to the gods, you do rituals, you start eyeing the neighbors well with deep suspicion. And then there's winter, not a snowy wonderland, more like bone-deep cold, thin blankets and fires that burn out by midnight. Heating isn't central. It's communal suffering. You warm your hands over a clay brazier and hope frostbite isn't fashionable this year. Even volcanoes occasionally join the party. Japan is part of the Ring of Fire. And yes, that's just as fun as it sounds. Eruptions could bury entire regions in ash, lava, or the awkward realization that your shrine is now a rock garden. There's no FEMA, no national relief effort. If your house collapses, you rebuild it. If your food spoils, you go hungry. And if your lord's estate is also affected, well, you still owe taxes. Disaster, after all, is not an excuse. In feudal Japan, nature isn't a background element. It's an ever-present reminder that even the gods might be having a bad day. In feudal Japan, power flows downhill, and so do responsibilities, expectations, and blame. You think you're important? Think again. There is always someone above you. Let's say you're a peasant. Your life is governed by the village headman who answers to the local samurai, who answers to the daimyo, who answers to the shogun, who maybe possibly whispers to the emperor, who doesn't rule so much as haunt the capital in expensive robes. Even the samurai, fierce, sword-carrying enforcers of justice, aren't at the top. They spend their lives serving a lord, waiting for orders, and occasionally fighting in battles they didn't start over land. They don't own for glory, they'll never personally receive. In theory, they're honored. In reality, they're very well-dressed middle management with a katana. The daimyo, those powerful lords who control provinces and armies, might seem untouchable until the shogun decides they're getting too bold. Then, suddenly, their castles are being inspected, their letters intercepted, and their heads very gently removed from their political ambitions. Even the shogun, the military dictator, the most powerful man in Japan, has to keep his eye on the court. The clans, the economy, and at least 4 cousins trying to poison his tea. He rules, yes, but he doesn't sleep well. Meanwhile, the emperor technically outranks everyone, but has no actual power. He's like a sacred relic you can't touch, but also can't ignore. He blesses rituals, names, eras, and occasionally writes poetry. He's also probably broke. This hierarchy isn't flexible. You don't climb it. You are placed and you stay put, like an overly obedient bonsai tree. Ambition isn't admired. It's feared. The higher you rise, the closer you get to a sword in your back. Respect is demanded upward and authority is enforced downward. Orders are obeyed, not discussed. Disagreements are dangerous. And any hint that you think you're above your station, that's not ambition. That's a death wish in formal attire. So wherever you are, peasant, merchant, samurai, or lord, someone above you controls your fate, and someone below you is hoping. You trip. In feudal Japan, what you learn, and whether you learn anything at all, depends entirely on where you sit on the social ladder. Spoiler: if you're near the bottom, the ladder is mostly invisible and occasionally on fire. Let's start at the top. Samurai children. They're the lucky ones. From a young age, they're trained in reading, writing, swordsmanship, etiquette, poetry, archery, horseback riding, and the ancient art of looking unimpressed at all times. A samurai. Boy learns how to compose a death poem by 14. You were just figuring out. Cursive. Their education is rigorous, but with a clear purpose: to serve, protect, and not embarrass the clan. They study Chinese classics, Bushido principles, and how to bow so precisely that the gods take notes. Then there are merchant and artisan families. They get some education, usually math, record-keeping, maybe a bit of reading, but only what's necessary for business. You're not reading Confucius. You're learning how to calculate the cost of pickled turnips in bulk. Practical? Yes. Glorious? Not really. Peasant children, education looks like this. This is a hoe. This is rice. Now, start working before the sun beats us to it. Your parents teach you how to farm, how to survive, and how to politely not die in front of the tax collector. Literacy is rare. Schooling is a luxury. The only scroll you'll read is "Theone nailed" to a tree explaining why your taxes just went up again. And girls, unless you're from a high-ranking family, you don't get much formal education at all. You're trained in domestic skills, sewing, etiquette, tea ceremonies, and how to maintain silence while maintaining a household. If you're really fortunate, you might learn calligraphy or poetry, as long as it doesn't distract you from folding laundry with spiritual precision. Education in feudal Japan isn't about personal growth. It's about fulfilling your role without asking questions. The idea of learning for fun would make most elders faint into their sake cups. So yes, knowledge is power, which is exactly why they kept it so tightly controlled. Feudal Japan is a land of breathtaking aesthetics. Everything from the curve of a fan to the placement of a teacup seems designed to soothe the soul and impress your ancestors. But here's the catch: you can and will be judged for doing it wrong. Culture in feudal Japan isn't just art, it's performance with consequences. The way you arrange flowers, pour tea, or fold a kimono isn't left to whimsy. It follows strict codes that have been around longer than your entire bloodline. One misplaced blossom, and suddenly you're the talk of the village, and not in a fun, flirty way. Take the tea ceremony, for example. It looks like a quiet, peaceful ritual. In reality, it's a social minefield. Everything is timed. Every movement is choreographed. The guest must sit just so, turn the cup twice, express humble gratitude, and drink in silence, all while mentally calculating whether they've bowed too early, too late, or too enthusiastically. Make a mistake. At best, it's awkward. At worst, it's seen as a character flaw or a moral failing passed down from your disgraceful great-granduncle. Then, there's calligraphy, a beautiful form of expression. Right? Wrong. It's a test of discipline, personality, and the alignment of your inner spirit. That brushstroke isn't just ink, it's a reflection of your soul's posture. Messy handwriting. Might as well wear a sign that says emotionally unstable and bad at bowing. Even poetry is dangerous. You don't just write a haiku, you write it in the proper season on the correct type of paper, using metaphor that references both nature and your emotional landscape, without getting too personal, too passionate. You lack refinement, too dry. You're spiritually cold, too clever. You're showing off, and now no one's inviting you to the moon viewing party. Culture here is a delicate game. You participate not to relax, but to prove that you are composed, refined, and deeply, deathly afraid of appearing uncultured. Beauty in feudal Japan isn't effortless. It's a battlefield in silk robes. And if your cabana arrangement doesn't follow the rules, well, may the gods have mercy on your bonsai. After all we've seen, the hierarchy, the hygiene, the honor, the endless rice, let's be honest, you wouldn't last a day in feudal Japan. Not because you're weak, not because you're soft, but because this wasn't a society designed for survival. It was one designed for submission, precision, and quiet, relentless obedience. Every moment was a test of posture, of loyalty, of whether or not you bowed at precisely the correct depth, while reciting a seasonal greeting in the right emotional tone. If you failed, there were consequences. Public shame at best, ritual death at worst. There were no days off, no just being yourself. You were born into a role, handed a script, and expected to perform it with deadly elegance for the rest of your life. Deviating wasn't seen as brave. It was seen as dangerous. The individual didn't matter. The clan did, the lord did, the land did. If you were a samurai, you carried the weight of centuries of honor and the very real threat of having to recite poetry before slicing open your own abdomen. If you were a peasant, you worked the land from dawn until your spine became a question mark, hoping the weather didn't betray you or your lord didn't. If you were a woman, your life was a carefully managed exercise in grace, silence, and sacrifice. And if you're anyone else, well, the system was designed to make sure you stayed exactly where you were. Feudal Japan was beautiful, yes, breathtakingly. So, the architecture, the rituals, the poetry, the art, all meticulously curated. But that beauty came with sharp edges. It required discipline so tight it could snap bones. It demanded respect so absolute it swallowed individuality whole. So no, you wouldn't last. You'd speak out of turn, or laugh too loudly, or accidentally. Step over a threshold with your left foot instead of your right. You'd forget to bow. You'd ask a question. You'd want to change something. And that alone would mark you as a threat to the order. But that's the brilliance and the tragedy of feudal Japan. It wasn't made to be easy. It was made to endure in an age where women were barely allowed to speak in public, let alone command an army. Artemisia of Caria existed like a historical glitch. Someone who absolutely, by all the rules of ancient society, should not have been possible. And yet, there she was, seated on a throne, wearing the double burden of queen and naval commander, plotting war alongside some of the most powerful men of the ancient world. Artemisia ruled Hakkanasis, a city nestled along the southwestern coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Technically a vassal under the sprawling Persian Empire, Hakkanasis was part of a patchwork of territories, often caught in the gravitational pull of regional powers. But Artemisia didn't simply inherit a political position. She made it dangerous. She was Greek by blood, Persian by loyalty, and a woman by biology. Each identity carrying immense weight in an age dominated by iron and testosterone. Her father was likely of Carian descent, while her mother hailed from the island of Crete. Upon her husband's death, instead of stepping aside for a male successor, Artemisia claimed the reins of power. That was already an act of quiet defiance, but she didn't stop at ruling. She wanted to conquer. When Xerxes the Great launched his legendary invasion of Greece around 480 BCE, Artemisia did something no other woman of her time dared. She volunteered for war, not to stitch bandages or offer prayers from a safe distance, but to command ships and risk death. She supplied 5 of her own vessels, sleek, fast, deadly, and led them personally into the thick of battle. And Xerxes, ruler of an empire stretching from India to Egypt, didn't just tolerate her presence. He listened to her, valued her. It was a bold move, some would say foolish. A Greek fighting for Persia, treasonous, a woman on a warship, unthinkable. But Artemisia knew what she was doing. She wasn't motivated by loyalty to bloodlines or empires. She was playing the game of survival and power, and she played it better than most of the men around her. In a world carved up by men with swords, Artemisia didn't ask for permission. She built her fleet, sailed into history, and dared anyone to stop her. By siding with Xerxes, Artemisia effectively declared war on her own people, the Greeks. It was a decision that raised eyebrows even before a single oar hit the water. And it wasn't just the usual whispers of treachery. This was personal. 2. The Greeks. She was a traitor in fine robes. A queen turned mercenary. A a woman who had traded heritage for favor at a foreign king's table. But Artemisia didn't seem the least bit bothered. In fact, she doubled down. She sailed into the campaign like she belonged at the high table of Persian power. And in many ways, she did. Xerxes, famous for surrounding himself with brutal warriors and sycophants, found in Artemisia something he rarely encountered. Honesty, blunt, piercing honesty. She told him not what he wanted to hear, but what he needed to know. In council meetings, surrounded by decorated generals and satraps with bloodied boots, Artemisia spoke with clarity and strategy, and she was rarely wrong. Her advice was sharp, tactical, and often laced with warnings others were too proud to voice. Before the infamous Battle of Salamis, she urged Xerxes to avoid direct naval confrontation with the Greeks, warning that the cramped straits would nullify Persia's numerical advantage. But Xerxes, swayed by overconfidence and flattery, ignored her. That decision would come back to haunt him. Even among her Persian allies, Artemisia's presence was complicated. Many commanders resented her authority. After all, she wasn't just a woman. She was a Greek woman, one who told truth to power and led her own ships with unnerving precision. She wasn't there as a figurehead or symbolic mascot. She was there to win, and that unsettled more than a few mustachioed warlords who'd spent their lives in the business of conquest. Meanwhile, back in Greece, her name spread like a stain. Herodotus himself from Hachanasses seemed both fascinated and baffled by her. He documented her with the mix of awe and suspicion usually reserved for mythical creatures. To some, she was Medusa in a breastplate. To others, a misunderstood genius with the audacity to think like a man and better than most of them. Artemisia was many things: loyalist, strategist, traitor, visionary, but above all, she was a political animal who understood one hard truth. In war, identity bends. Only power remains. If there was ever a stage that tested Artemisia's brilliance and boldness, it was the Battle of Salamis. This wasn't just any battle. It was the naval showdown of the Greco-Persian Wars. The Persian fleet, massive and overconfident, squared off against a much smaller but strategically positioned Greek navy in the narrow straits near Athens. It was here that Xerxes' campaign would falter, and it was here that Artemisia would make one of the most shocking tactical moves of her career. Let's rewind slightly. Artemisia had warned Xerxes not to engage the Greeks in these narrow waters. She argued correctly that their superior maneuverability and familiarity with the terrain would nullify the Persian size advantage. But Xerxes, intoxicated by numbers and pride, dismissed her warning. He wanted a spectacular victory. What he got instead was humiliation. As the battle raged, chaos swallowed the Persian lines. Ships collided, formations broke, and Greek tires darted like sharks between lumbering vessels. It was a slaughter, and in the middle of it all was Artemisia, commanding her flagship, surrounded by allies and enemies, trying to survive a collapsing battle. Here's where things get wild. With a Greek ship pursuing her relentlessly, Artemisia made a decision that historians still debate today. She ordered her ship to ram and sink another Persian vessel, one from an allied king no less. The move was so unexpected that the Greeks, assuming she must be on their side, stopped chasing her. She slipped away untouched. Xerxes, watching from a hilltop, supposedly witnessed this and turned to his aides, exclaiming, "My men have become women, and my women have become men." It was perhaps the highest praise he ever gave a subordinate, especially one who had just sacrificed a friendly ship to save herself. But Artemisia's move wasn't just about survival. It was strategy, misdirection, and cold-blooded calculation wrapped into one. She read the battlefield in real time and made a split-second decision that saved her ship, her crew, and possibly her own life. It was controversial, it was brutal, but it worked. While many Persian commanders died that day or fell into disgrace, Artemisia sailed back not as a failure, but as one of the only leaders Xerxes still trusted. The Persian fleet limped back from Salamis humiliated. Ships were lost, morale shattered, and the myth of Persian naval invincibility obliterated. For many commanders, this was the beginning of the end. But for Artemisia, it was a strange kind of triumph. In the middle of a disastrous campaign, she emerged as the lone figure of competence. Someone who had warned the king, acted decisively, and escaped unscathed. Xerxes took notice. Now back on land, licking the wounds of defeat, the Persian war machine had to pivot, and in a rare moment of candid trust, Xerxes turned once again to Artemisia, not as a novelty, but as his most reliable advisor. He asked her a deeply personal question. What should he do next? Artemisia, ever blunt, told him exactly what no proud emperor wanted to hear: retreat. She urged him to return to Persia and leave his trusted general Mardonius in charge of the remaining campaign in Greece. You've achieved what you needed. Athens has burned. Don't push your luck. That was essentially her message. And incredibly, Xerxes listened. The man who had ignored most of his war council followed the advice of a single woman. It was a moment that confirmed what others had only suspected. Artemisia wasn't just brave, she was politically lethal. She knew when to fight, when to deceive, and now when to walk away. Her power didn't come from brute force. It came from clarity, something in short supply among kings and conquerors. In the aftermath, she was entrusted with the guardianship of Xerxes' sons, an honor that spoke volumes. In ancient courts, you didn't hand your heirs to just anyone. You chose someone whose loyalty was ironclad and whose judgment could be trusted. Artemisia, a woman born on the fringes of empire, had now placed herself right at its heart. Back in Hyrcanus's, she returned not as a queen uncertain of her place, but as a figure of undeniable consequence. Her legend began to take root. She wasn't just a ruler anymore. She was the woman who stood face to face with empires and didn't blink. Where most would have sought safety and silence, Artemisia had stepped into war and somehow came back more powerful than when she left. While Artemisia's military feats gained her notoriety, her legacy didn't grow alone on the battlefield. It also thrived in the minds of those who recorded it, especially in the pen of Herodotus, the so-called father of history, who just so happened to be born in Hyrcanus, the very city Artemisia ruled. This geographic coincidence added an almost eerie intimacy to his account of her life. He wasn't writing about some distant myth. He was writing about his queen, and yet, Herodotus didn't present her as a caricature of feminine virtue or villain. He painted her as something much rarer in historical record, a competent, calculating, and compelling leader. His account of the Battle of Salamis highlights not only her courage, but her cold pragmatism, the sinking of the Allied ship, the escape under Greek confusion, the brutal brilliance of it all. In Herodotus's work, Artemisia becomes more than a commander. She becomes a contradiction, both admired and feared, respected and suspected. But make no mistake, that respect was hard-earned. She existed in the shadow of men, powerful ones like Xerxes and Mardonius, but somehow she outshone them all. While they drowned in ambition, she floated on foresight. She knew when to fight and when to vanish. That kind of wisdom is rare. Rarer still when it comes from a woman in a world that equated femininity with fragility. And perhaps that's what intrigued Herodotus the most. Artemisia didn't fit. Not in the cultural mold of her time, and certainly not in the comfortable categories historians like to build. She wasn't a rebel, but she disobeyed. She wasn't a feminist, because the concept didn't exist, but she undermined patriarchy through competence alone. Her legacy spread quietly, not through monuments or golden statues, but through stories, echoes passed along by men who were forced to admit she was better than them. In war councils, she outthought them. In battle, she outmaneuvered them. And in politics, she outlasted them. For all their noise, the men of her time ended up needing scribes to keep their memory alive. Artemisia had something better. Or as Herodotus put down his scroll and dipped his pen again, he wasn't just writing history. He was recording a riddle in the shape of a queen. Strangely enough, the name Artemisia didn't vanish after her death. About a century later, it returned, this time in the form of another queen, Artemisia the Seku of Caria, a namesake and likely descendant who also ruled Halicarnassus. But while the second Artemisia never commanded fleets in battle, she too would carve her name into the bones of history, quite literally. Her claim to fame, building one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the mausoleum at Halicarnassus. The second Artemisia commissioned this towering marble tomb for her husband Mausolus, who was also her brother, because ancient dynastic politics never failed to get awkward. But it wasn't just a tribute to grief. It was a statement, a monument to Carian identity, and an echo of the strength that the first Artemisia had once wielded. Historians have long debated whether the two women were directly related. Mother and daughter, aunt and niece, possibly not related at all. But one thing is clear. The name Artemisia had by then become synonymous with power, intellect, and bold rule. The legacy of the original queen had seeped so deeply into the identity of Halicarnassus that future generations wore it like armor. Even more fascinating is how the later Artemisia's mausoleum gave us the very word we use today for monumental tombs. Mausoleum, a linguistic legacy born from stone, grief, and political theatre. And while the second Artemisia was known for mourning, she was also a capable ruler, continuing the thread of female leadership in a corner of the ancient world where that was anything but normal. But let's not forget the foundation for all of this was laid by the first Artemisia, the naval commander, the queen who advised Xerxes, the woman who navigated the Greek world as both insider and outsider. Without her, the name might have faded. Halicarnassus might have been just another forgotten city on a forgotten coast. Instead, it became a beacon, a place where 2 powerful women shaped history, not through accident, but through audacity. Their stories, though separated by time, speak to each other across the centuries. One with ships, one with stone, and both with names history could not quite bury. Artemisia's story has always lived in the in-between, between empires, between genders, between legend and history. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the way her legacy has been argued, bent, and reinterpreted over the centuries. Was she a Persian puppet, a Greek traitor, or simply a sovereign playing chess, while others were busy swinging swords? To Persians, she was a loyal commander, one of the few who gave sound advice and fought with distinction. Xerxes clearly trusted her more than many of his seasoned generals. That in itself speaks volumes about her political sharpness and composure under pressure. In the Persian world, her loyalty was seen as honorable, perhaps even heroic. To the Greeks, it was more complicated. Many viewed her as a turncoat, someone who had betrayed her Hellenic roots to side with an Eastern desperate. And yet, even Greek chroniclers, notably Herodotus, couldn't help but admire her intelligence and cunning. She was in many ways a mirror to their own contradictions, proving that not all Greeks stood with Greece and not all Persians were villains. She defied the lines that war tried to draw. And then there's the modern view where historians and readers alike continue to wrestle with what she represents. A feminist icon before feminism, maybe a symbol of shrewd leadership in a world built to exclude her. Absolutely. Her legacy continues to fascinate, not because she fit the mold of ancient queens, but because she cracked it open. In military circles, she is still cited in naval histories, often as a rare case of a woman commanding warships in antiquity. In literary and political circles, she appears as a symbol of reason in an age of hubris. And in popular culture, she occasionally resurfaces, sometimes twisted, sometimes glamorized, but always unmistakable. But here's the truth. Artemisia didn't care about legacy, not in the way we do. She wasn't building a brand or writing memoirs. She was trying to survive, to rule, to win. And that's what makes her story so enduring. It wasn't shaped by vanity or myth-making. It was shaped by decisions, hard ones, controversial ones, and more often than not, the right ones. She didn't belong to Persia. She didn't belong to Greece. She belonged to herself. As the centuries passed, Artemisia's story did what all great stories eventually do. It mutated. She was no longer just a historical figure. She became myth, metaphor, and sometimes monster. Writers and dramatists reinvented her as they pleased. In some tales, she was a cruel seductress. In others, a warrior queen possessed by bloodlust. The real Artemisia, the tactician, the realist, the survivor, was buried under layers of fantasy and fear. Part of this distortion came from a simple truth. Men didn't know what to make of her. A woman who gave orders, who didn't crumble in the face of war, who told kings they were wrong and proved it. That didn't sit well with the ancient world. So storytellers did what they often do when faced with a woman they can't control. They rewrote her. One bizarre legend claimed that she fell hopelessly in love with a man who didn't return her affections, and in a fit of despair she threw herself from a cliff. Not exactly the kind of thing a steely naval commander does, but it served the narrative of turning strength into tragedy. Another version painted her as a venomous schemer, more witch than queen. It's a pattern that repeats across history. When a woman gains power through intellect or audacity, later generations either soften her into a damsel or darken her into a villain. Artemisia got both treatments, neither of which honored the truth. The real Artemisia didn't rule with seduction or superstition. She ruled with vision, reason, and cold strategic brilliance. She played a man's game by her own rules and won. That more than anything terrified those who came after her. Because if one woman could do it, what was to stop others? Even in modern times, adaptations continue to distort her. Hollywood, for example, recast her as a vengeance-fueled femme fatale in 300, Rise of an Empire. Entertaining? Sure. Accurate? Absolutely not. But the fact that she still draws attention, still demands reinvention, proves one thing. Her legacy has teeth. The woman they feared didn't die. She evolved into myth, into memory, and into the long, uncomfortable question history keeps asking. What if more women had been like Artemisia? When Artemisia of Korea vanished from the records, she didn't vanish from history. She simply shifted form. Like the wake left behind a warship, her legacy rippled outward long after she sailed her final voyage. No grand tomb marks her resting place. No statues survive bearing her likeness. And yet her presence endures, etched into the bones of Hikanes, whispered in the pages of ancient chronicles, and debated in the halls of every historian trying to understand how she pulled off the impossible. Because Artemisia's life was exactly that, impossible. She ruled when women weren't supposed to rule, fought in wars where women weren't supposed to fight, gave advice where women weren't supposed to speak. And still, somehow, she was heard. She wasn't merely tolerated. She was respected. That is perhaps her rarest achievement, not just surviving the ancient world as a woman in power, but earning the kind of grudging admiration that made even her enemies pause. Centuries later, her name remains a paradox, simultaneously exalted and obscured. She's not the household name that Cleopatra or Joan of Arc became, but perhaps that's fitting. Artemisia didn't chase legend. She chased outcomes. She wasn't adorned with mythic beauty or tragic romance. She was a leader, a realist, a strategist. Her drama played out, not in poetry, but in the silence of war rooms, in the tight quarters of a ship, and in the long stare of a king who chose to listen. Today, her story invites re-examination, not just as a tale of a woman in a man's world, but as a reminder that courage doesn't always wear a crown or raise a sword. Sometimes it sits at the edge of power, says the uncomfortable thing, and sails straight into chaos. Artemisia didn't need to be rescued. She didn't need to be rewritten. What she needed, what she still deserves, is to be remembered as she was. Sharp, dangerous, brilliant. In an empire built by men, she charted her own course across hostile seas, against cultural gravity and through the fog of war. And as long as ships sail and history remembers those who dare to speak when silence is safer, Artemisia of Caria will never be truly gone. Before lenses and satellites, before Copernicus dared rearrange the cosmos, humanity had only two tools for unlocking the secrets of the sky, the naked eye and stone. And somehow that was enough. Across the ancient world, civilizations looked up, not just in wonder, but with intent. The stars were not mere decoration. They were calendars, compasses, gods and prophecies, and so began the oldest science of all, astronomy. Long before it had a name, it was a necessity. Farmers needed to know when to plant. Sailors needed to know how to steer. Priests needed to know when to perform the right ritual at the right, celestial moment. And astronomers, often indistinguishable from priests, kings, or mathematicians, were the ones everyone relied on. But without telescopes, how did they do it? They built temples, not just for worship, but for watching. Massive structures like Stonehenge in England, Naphtali in Egypt, and the Great Pyramids of Mesoamerica weren't just tombs or altars. They were observatories carefully aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. Many were designed to capture specific light patterns on solstices and equinoxes. Sacred architecture with astronomical purpose. The Great Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak in Egypt, for example, was oriented so that the sun would rise precisely between its pylons on the summer solstice. The Maya at Chichen Itza built El Castillo, a pyramid that casts a shadow of a serpent slithering down its staircase on the spring and autumn equinoxes. In India, vast stone instruments like the Yantar Mantar allowed astronomers to track the declination of celestial bodies with remarkable precision. These weren't accidents. These weren't crude guesses. These were deliberate, data-driven feats of cosmic engineering. And they weren't isolated. From the Andes to the Nile, from Babylon to Beijing, humans were building with the stars in mind, sinking stone with starlight. They charted planetary motions, eclipses, and even retrograde movement with nothing but patience, observation, and a deep sense of cosmic order. The sky wasn't just watched, it was measured, mapped, and built into the very bones of their cities. Long before glass could magnify the heavens, civilizations were already recording their rhythm in stone, in silence, and with astonishing accuracy. In the sun-baked floodplains of ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians looked up and saw not just stars, but structure. Around 3000 BCE, they weren't simply telling stories about the heavens, they were organizing life around them. To the Sumerians, Thesky wasn't random, it was a cosmic schedule, and their job was to interpret it correctly. These early astronomers laid the groundwork for what we now call celestial mechanics. They observed the regular motions of the sun, moon, and planets, and realized these movements weren't chaos. They were clocks. That's how they developed one of the earliest known calendars, dividing the year based on the lunar cycle. It wasn't perfect, but it was remarkably effective for tracking agricultural and ritual events. And speaking of time, the Sumerians gave us the sexagesimal system, the base 60 counting method still baked into how we measure minutes, seconds, and degrees. When you glance at a clock showing 60 minutes in an hour or 360 in a circle, you're echoing a 5,000-year-old way of thinking. They didn't have telescopes, but they had ziggurats, step towers rising toward the heavens. From these platforms, priest astronomers kept careful records on clay tablets, noting when Venus appeared on the horizon, when the moon turned red during an eclipse, or when a star cluster returned after months below the horizon. Their word for these watchers, Umanu, learned ones, both scientists and spiritual guides. Over time, Sumerian stargazing would evolve into something more systematic. Their descendants, the Babylonians, built vast star catalogues, predicted eclipses with eerie accuracy, and gave names to constellations that are still in use today. But it all began with the Sumerians scribbling celestial movements in cuneiform and laying down the earliest astronomical records we've ever found. Perhaps most impressive is how this early science blended seamlessly with mythology. To them, the sky was divine, yet predictable. The The gods moved in patterns, and if you understood those patterns, you could align your crops, your rituals, and your fate. The Sumerians didn't just look up in awe. They looked up and began to measure, and in doing so, they started humanity's long relationship with the stars. If the Sumerians lit the first fire of astronomy, the Babylonians poured oil on it and turned it into an inferno of precision. By the time their empire flourished around 1800 BCE, Babylonian astronomers weren't just watching the skies, they were predicting them. Eclipses, planetary conjunctions, retrograde motion, all charted, logged, and projected with stunning regularity. They weren't guessing, they were calculating. The Babylonians took the Sumerians' observational legacy and supercharged it with math. They recorded the positions of stars, planets, and the moon on clay tablets, known today as the Enuma Anu Enlil and the Muapin, some of the oldest known astronomical texts in existence. These weren't bedtime stories, they were raw data. Line after line of celestial movements. When Venus would rise, how long it would shine, when a solar eclipse might strike. These tablets were essentially the world's first almanac. The most remarkable part, they could predict lunar eclipses using a pattern known as the Saros cycle, a period of roughly 18 years after which eclipses repeat. They didn't understand why it worked, but they knew it did work, and that was enough. For a culture that fused divination with astronomy, being able to foresee cosmic events gave them enormous power, both spiritual and political. And while the Greeks are often credited with inventing the zodiac, the truth is the Babylonians got there first. They divided the sky into 12 equal parts, each anchored to a constellation, and laid the foundation for what would become the zodiac signs we still use and misuse today. Yes, when someone asks your sign, you can thank Babylon. But what really sets the Babylonians apart is their mathematical boldness. They tracked planetary motion, even retrograde paths, and used arithmetic methods to approximate celestial cycles. Not geometric models, mind you, that would come later with the Greeks, but arithmetic that worked. And for practical purposes, that was more than enough. They saw the universe as a ledger of patterns, a giant machine of repeating cycles. And their astronomers were not just mystics or priests. They were early scientists hunched over tablets, decoding the rhythms of the cosmos in symbols and numbers. In the dark, they wrote the sky. While the Babylonians were busy predicting eclipses, the ancient Egyptians were syncing their entire civilization to the stars quite literally. In the Nile Valley, astronomy wasn't just a curiosity, it was survival. And at the heart of it all was a single star, Sirius, the brightest light in the night sky. The Egyptians noticed something extraordinary. Each year, just before the annual flooding of the Nile, Sirius would reappear on the horizon during dawn. This event, known as the helical rising of Sirius, became the cornerstone of their calendar. That wasn't just poetic, it was vital. The Nile's floodwaters determined crop cycles, and missing that window could mean famine. So, the Egyptians created a 365-day solar calendar divided into 12 months of 30 days, plus 5 festival days. It was remarkably close to our modern calendar, centuries before Julius Caesar ever got involved. But the Egyptians didn't stop with Sirius. They tracked the sun, moon, and stars from their temples, many of which were aligned with astonishing astronomical precision. The Temple of Karnak, for instance, was oriented so the sun would rise directly through its axis during the summer solstice. Other temples lined up with the rising and setting of stars, considered sacred. And then there were the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, constructed around 2560 BCE, was aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal points. Its shafts may have been pointed towards specific stars, possibly Orion and Sirius, hinting at a celestial connection between the heavens and the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. This wasn't just burial architecture, it was cosmological engineering. Egyptian priests often served double duty as astronomers. They observed the skies not only for ritual timing, but for signs, omens, and the will of the gods. Astronomy, theology, and governance were tightly interwoven. to rule Egypt was to understand the sky. What's remarkable is that without telescopes, without even lenses, they developed an entire system for tracking time, orienting buildings, and forecasting natural events, all based on patient observation and relentless precision. The Egyptians didn't look at the sky for entertainment. They looked up and saw a divine clock ticking with purpose, echoing eternity. Deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, long before Europeans set foot in the New World, the Mer were building one of the most sophisticated astronomical systems the world had ever seen. Without metal tools, without wheels, and without telescopes, they mapped the movements of the sun, moon, planets, and stars with a precision that still baffles modern scholars. To the Mer, astronomy was not a luxury of the learned elite. It was the framework of society itself. Their rulers were seen as cosmic intermediaries, and every major political or religious event was timed to match a celestial counterpart. Eclipses, solstices, equinoxes, and Venus cycles weren't just observed. They were used to legitimize power. One of their most striking achievements was their tracking of Venus. The Mayan noted that Venus disappeared and reappeared in the sky in a repeating cycle of 584 days, and they tied this rhythm into their ritual warfare and calendar systems. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving pre-Collian manuscripts, contains a Venus table that tracks the planet's movements over hundreds of years with an error of less than 1 day. They didn't stop there. The Merid-long count calendar capable of tracking dates over spans of thousands of years. They understood the solar year with incredible accuracy, about 36520 days, remarkably close to the modern value. Their calendar systems were so refined that multiple ones ran simultaneously. The 260-day ritual calendar, Zulkan, the 365-day solar calendar, Harb, and the long count for historical chronology. And the observatories, they didn't have glass domes, but they had stone genius. The El Caracol Observatory at Chichen Itza was built, with specific windows and alignments that allowed Mayan priests to track the movements of Venus and the sun. Temple staircases and shadow effects were timed to equinoxes, like the famous serpent shadow that slithers down El Castillo during the spring and autumn. The Maya weren't just watching the skies, they were synchronizing their civilization with them. Their kings ruled by the stars, their temples rose in tune with solstices, and their wars were timed with the wanderings of Venus. They didn't just read the cosmos, they wove it into the fabric of life. In ancient China, astronomy wasn't simply a science, it was a matter of state. The emperor, regarded as the son of heaven, ruled with the mandate of heaven, a cosmic endorsement that could be revoked if the stars sent the wrong message. That made astronomy both sacred and political. If the sky changed, so could the dynasty. As early as 2000 BCE, Chinese astronomers were tracking celestial events and documenting them with methodical care. They recorded comets, novae, eclipses, sunspots, and planetary motions. Some of these records, like those found in the Shai records of the Grand Historian and the Book of Han, are still referenced by modern scientists today to verify ancient astronomical phenomena. Perhaps most remarkable is their documentation of a supernova explosion in 1054 CE, visible in daylight for 23 days. Chinese astronomers recorded its location with such accuracy that modern astronomers use the data to identify the remnants, now known as the Crab Nebula. But China's astronomical prowess didn't rely on mystical interpretation alone. They developed mechanical devices such as armillary spheres and gnomons, shadow-casting rods to measure the altitude of the sun and the positions of stars. In fact, the Chinese had working watered celestial globes and astronomical clocks centuries before Europe. Caught up, Chinese astronomers divided the sky into 28 lunar mansions, similar in concept to Western constellations, and used them for both navigation and timekeeping. They also created the Chinese lunar solar calendar, which balanced lunar months with the solar year and remains in use today to determine traditional holidays like the Lunar New Year. One of their key contributions was the meticulous recording of eclipses. They not only predicted solar and lunar eclipses, but sometimes tied them to dynastic omens. If an eclipse occurred and the emperor hadn't been forewarned, it was considered a failure of the astronomers, and sometimes a sign that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. In short, astronomy in China wasn't tucked away in a scholar's study. It stood at the very core of governance, divinity, and national survival. The stars didn't just tell time, they told truth, and the empire listened. In ancient India, astronomy was never a separate discipline. It was interwoven with philosophy, ritual, mathematics, and metaphysics. Known as Jyotisha, the science of light, Indian astronomy began as a tool for determining auspicious timings for rituals, but evolved into one of the most mathematically advanced systems of celestial observation in the ancient world. The earliest references to celestial events appear in the Vedas composed around 1500 BCE. These sacred texts mention the sun, moon, and planetary cycles, as well as the division of the sky into 27 nakshatras, lunar mansions that formed the core of early Indian sky mapping. These nakshatras were tied to both mythology and calculation, forming the basis of astrological charts and calendars still used in India today. But Indian astronomy wasn't just poetic, it was shockingly precise. Ancient scholars developed models for the solar year that were more accurate than the Julian calendar introduced much later by the Romans. The Surya Siddhanta, a foundational astronomical text compiled around 500 CE based on earlier knowledge, describes the Earth's axial tilt, the elliptical orbits of planets, and even the concept of gravity centuries before Newton. Perhaps the most revolutionary figure in Indian astronomy was Aryabhata, who in 499 CE proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis daily, a theory rarely entertained in other parts of the world at that time. He also calculated the length of the solar year at 365.358 days, just a tiny fraction off from modern values, and developed advanced trigonometric functions to assist in astronomical calculations. Indian astronomers also created sophisticated signs, worked with decimal notation, and used shadow instruments and spheres to measure angles and altitudes. Observatories were often aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and planetary conjunctions. But beyond technical achievements, Indian astronomy carried a cosmic elegance. The universe wasn't just a machine. It was a cycle, a dance of time and space unfolding endlessly. Astronomy wasn't about domination over nature. It was about harmony with it. In the Indian worldview, understanding the heavens was a way of understanding the self, a geometry of spirit, where planets moved not just across the sky, but through the soul. If other civilizations looked to the sky for guidance, ritual, or survival, the ancient Greeks looked up and asked why. Why do the stars move? Why? Do planets wander? And most importantly, can the cosmos be explained by reason? Greek astronomy marked a turning point in humanity's relationship with the heavens. Where others saw patterns and portents, the Greeks sought laws. They weren't just observers. They were theorists trying to decode the sky using mathematics, geometry, and philosophy. It began with Thales of Miletus, one of the first to suggest that celestial phenomena had natural causes. Then came an Anaximander who imagined the Earth floating in space unsupported and suggested that the heavens formed a sphere. These ideas may sound crude today, but for their time, they were revolutionary. The true leap came with Pythagoras, who viewed the cosmos as a system of perfect harmony, a music of the spheres governed by mathematical ratios. His followers believed the universe could be understood through numbers, laying the foundation for theoretical astronomy. But it was Aristarchus of Samos who came closest to modern truth. In the 3rd century BCE, he proposed a heliocentric model with the sun, not the Earth, at the center of the universe. His ideas were ignored for nearly 2,000 years, but they planted a seed that would later bloom with Copernicus. Then came Hipparchus, the father of observational astronomy. He created the first star catalogue, divided stars by brightness, discovered the precession of the equinoxes, and developed trigonometric tools to calculate celestial positions. His accuracy was astonishing, especially without telescopes. And finally, there was Claudius Ptolemy, whose Almaz became the authoritative astronomical text for over a millennium. He synthesized Greek, Babylonian and Egyptian knowledge into a geocentric model that explained planetary motion using epicles and deference, a complex yet elegant system that worked until it didn't. While some Greek ideas were wrong, their commitment to rational explanation and systematic modeling changed the game. They taught the world that the stars weren't random. They were governed by patterns that the human mind could understand. With the Greeks, astronomy became more than observation. It became an argument between earth and sky, between logic and myth, and between what we see and what we know. By the time the telescope was invented in the early 17th century, humanity had already spent thousands of years watching the skies with nothing but eyes, shadows, and stone. And yet, what those ancient civilizations achieved is nothing short of astonishing. They mapped stars, tracked planets, predicted eclipses, and built monuments aligned with solstices and equinoxes, all without lenses, satellites, or electricity. What makes their accomplishments even more extraordinary is that they did it independently. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Maya in Mesoamerica, the Chinese and Indians in Asia, the Greeks and Egyptians around the Mediterranean, they all developed astronomical systems rooted in their own worldviews. Yet, despite being oceans apart, they arrived at similar conclusions. The heavens move with order, and that order matters. Ancient astronomy wasn't confined to ivory towers. It shaped agriculture, religion, architecture, politics, and philosophy. It dictated when to plant, when to pray, when to build, and when to rule. In every culture, understanding the sky was seen as a way of understanding the divine, or at the very least, one's place in the vast machinery of existence. And while their models varied, some geocentric, some mythological, some cyclical, they all shared one trait: a deep, unwavering respect for the cosmos. For many ancient peoples, the sky wasn't just a backdrop, it was alive, deliberate, and sacred. The telescope would eventually change everything. It revealed moons circling Jupiter, phases of Venus, sunspots, and galaxies far beyond our own. But the groundwork, the patient mapping, the systematic records, the sheer curiosity that belonged to the ancients. Today, we carry their legacy every time we check a calendar, map the stars with a phone app, or celebrate a solstice. Every GPS, satellite, and space mission is built on a foundation they laid in clay, stone, and papyrus. They didn't know about black holes or cosmic microwave backgrounds, but they asked the right questions. They looked up and they noticed. In the darkness, without knowing it, they became the first scientists. Quietly, faithfully, they wrote their questions in the sky. And thanks to them, we now have the tools to look deeper, not just into space, but into our own origins. In 1803, something unprecedented happened. A young republic barely 3 decades old bought a landmass so vast it doubled its territory overnight. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a real estate deal, it was a geopolitical thunderclap. With the stroke of Appin, the United States acquired more than 828,000 square miles of land from France, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. 13 future states would eventually rise from this vast fertile terrain. And the price, a cool $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre. But what makes this even more extraordinary is that no one, not even the Americans, saw it coming. At the time, President Thomas Jefferson had one goal: to secure access to the Mississippi River and the crucial port city of New Orleans. The young nation was heavily dependent on river trade. Farmers in the Ohio Valley needed to float their goods south, and whoever controlled New Orleans held the keys to economic survival. Jefferson authorized diplomats to offer France up to $10 million just for New Orleans and some nearby lands. That's it. But when those diplomats arrived, they were blindsided. The French had a counteroffer. Not just New Orleans, the entire Louisiana territory. Why? France under Napoleon Bonaparte was shifting its priorities. Napoleon had dreams of a grand North American empire, but the Haitian Revolution had crushed French ambitions in the Caribbean. disease, rebellion, and mounting tensions with Britain made holding on to Louisiana more trouble than it was worth. Napoleon needed money for war, not swamps and prairie. Faced with an unexpected opportunity, the American negotiators said yes quickly, even before they could get full approval from Jefferson. After all, this wasn't just a port. It was the Mississippi River, the Great Plains, access to the Rocky Mountains, and future control over the heart of the continent. What Jefferson received wasn't just land, it was destiny. A blank canvas for westward expansion, national growth, and inevitably conflict. But while newspapers celebrated, one truth was ignored. This land was not empty. It was already home to dozens of native nations, each with their own histories, alliances, and claims. And so, a deal made in Paris would not only reshape maps, it would alter lives across an entire continent. At the heart of the Louisiana Purchase stood one man with a crown and a headache, Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1803, the French emperor was fighting on too many fronts in Europe, in the Caribbean, and in his own treasury. And so, in an act that shocked nearly everyone involved, he offered to sell off a third of North America to the very country he'd once hoped to block from continental power. It hadn't started that way. Just a few years earlier, France had secretly acquired Louisiana from Spain under the Treaty of San-Ildefonso. Napoleon had grand dreams of restoring a French colonial empire. Louisiana would feed Sandan, the crown, jewel of France's Caribbean colonies, today known as Haiti, with wheat, meat, and supplies. France didn't want Louisiana for its own sake. It wanted it to support sugar. But that vision collapsed in fire and fever. The Haitian Revolution, led by formerly enslaved people under leaders like Toussaint Louverture, had erupted into full rebellion. France sent tens of thousands of troops to crush it and watched them die by the thousands. Not just from battle, but from yellow fever. Napoleon lost his best general, his army, and his chance to reclaim the richest sugar colony on earth. With Saint-Domingue slipping away, Louisiana became irrelevant, worse than irrelevant. It was now indefensible. And with Britain preparing for another war against France, Napoleon feared Louisiana might be taken by force. So instead of fighting to keep it, he sold it. And in typical Napoleon fashion, the decision was fast, bold, and entirely pragmatic. On April 11th, 1803, he stunned American diplomats Robert Livingston and James Monroe with an offer. All of Louisiana, not just New Orleans, for $15 million. Napoleon's reasoning was simple. I have given England a maritime rival that will sooner or later humble her pride. He didn't just want money, he wanted the US to grow strong enough to stand against Britain. Selling Louisiana wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And so, in a single act, Napoleon abandoned his American empire and changed the future of a country he barely respected. What was an imperial afterthought to him would become the launching pad for America's expansion west and the beginning of the end for native sovereignty across the continent. Thomas Jefferson had long envisioned an agrarian republic, a nation of independent farmers living on their own land, bound together by liberty and civic virtue. The Louisiana Purchase should have been his dream come true, but instead it gave him a constitutional nightmare. Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government should only exercise powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. And guess what? Nowhere in that document did it say the US government could buy foreign territory. There was no clause for purchasing a continent, no legal roadmap for doubling the size of the nation in one transaction. So Jefferson hesitated. The offer from Napoleon was almost too good to be true. $15 million for land stretching from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. It was a once-in-a-civilization opportunity, but Jefferson wrestled with a contradiction. Could he, a man who feared federal overreach, stretch the Constitution to justify such a massive acquisition? In private, he considered proposing a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase. But the clock was ticking, and political realities loomed. If he delayed, Napoleon might change his mind, or Britain might seize the territory before the ink could dry. So Jefferson did something ironic. He embraced implied powers the very thing he had criticized Alexander Hamilton for advocating years earlier. He rationalized the purchase as a treaty which the Constitution did allow the president to make with Senate approval. The Senate ratified the deal in October 1803 with overwhelming support, and Jefferson, while quietly uneasy, defended his decision as necessary for the survival and security of the Republic. And just like that, Jefferson, the constitutional purist, became the architect of the largest peaceful land acquisition in US history. The contradiction wasn't lost on his critics, who called him a hypocrite, but Jefferson saw it as a necessary compromise, bending the Constitution, in his view, to preserve the Republic rather than destroy it. In doing so, he set a precedent. The federal government could acquire land by treaty, even without explicit constitutional authority, and that precedent would be invoked again and again as the United States expanded further west and into territories already lived on by others. The Louisiana Purchase had been signed, sealed, and ratified, but nobody really knew what the US had just bought. The land was vast, sparsely mapped, and filled with unknown rivers, mountains, species, and people. So, in 1804, President Jefferson commissioned an expedition that would become one of the most iconic journeys in American history, the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Their mission was ambitious: explore the new territory, establish trade with native nations, study the land's resources, and most importantly, find a water route to the Pacific Ocean. Jefferson dreamed of a Northwest Passage, a navigable link between the Atlantic and Pacific that would revolutionize trade. Spoiler, it didn't exist. But what Lewis and Clark found would still transform how Americans saw their place on the continent. They started in St. Louis in May 1804 with a team of over 30 men and headed upriver into land untouched by American settlers. Along the way, they documented over 100 new animal species and 178 new plants. They mapped rivers, sketched mountains, and kept meticulous journals filled with scientific and ethnographic observations. But they didn't do it alone. One of the most essential figures on the journey was Sacagawea, a young Shoshone woman who joined the expedition with her French-Canadian husband. Sacagawea was not just a translator. She was a symbol of peace. Her presence with a child signaled to native tribes that this was not a war party. Her knowledge of geography and diplomacy helped the Corps survive dangerous crossings and build crucial alliances. Over 2 years, the expedition traveled more than 8,000 men, all by boat, horse, and foot. They reached the Pacific Ocean in November 1805, built a fort for the winter, and returned east by 1806. They didn't find a Northwest Passage, but they brought back something arguably more valuable: a detailed account of the newly acquired land and the people who lived there. Jefferson had purchased a mystery. Lewis and Clark began to make it real. But while their reports inspired dreams of westward expansion, they also foreshadowed something darker: the coming pressure on indigenous nations and the inevitable push toward conquest under the banner of discovery. To American politicians and settlers, the Louisiana Purchase was a land bonanza, a blank slate for farms, cities, and ambition. But to the native nations who had lived there for centuries, it was something else entirely: the beginning of Eurasia. The land the US had purchased from France was already home to over 50 sovereign indigenous nations, each with its own language, territory, and system of governance. From the Ojan Sioux to the Cheyenne, Comanche, and Mandan, these communities had been managing the land, trading with one another, and making alliances long before any European flag had been planted. But in the eyes of Jefferson and future US leaders, the Louisiana Territory was a canvas, vast, underused, and ripe for American settlement. The native nations who lived there were not consulted in the deal. They weren't notified. They weren't compensated. One day, they were sovereign peoples. The next, they were declared subjects of the expanding American Republic. Jefferson believed native people could either assimilate into American society or relocate peacefully if possible, but forcibly if necessary. In private letters, he wrote that as settlers moved west, indigenous people would have to move westward too, or perish. It wasn't yet called removal, but the idea was already forming. This pressure intensified after the Lewis and Clark expedition returned with news of abundant land and natural wealth. The federal government began negotiating treaties, many of them deceptive or coercive, to claim land and push tribes farther west. In some cases, military force backed these efforts. In others, it was disease and displacement that did the work. The Louisiana Purchase marked the start of a new phase in U.S. expansion. Manifest destiny before it had a name. The belief that the United States was meant to control the continent had its legal foundation in this sale, and its moral cost in the lives and lands of native nations. For indigenous peoples, the Louisiana Purchase was not a transaction. It was a trespass. It redrew maps that had never been theirs, erased boundaries that had never been acknowledged, and unleashed a wave of settlers who came not to trade, but to take. And that wave was only just beginning. The Louisiana Purchase was hailed as a triumph, a peaceful acquisition of territory that nearly doubled the size of the United States. But while the land deal was clean on paper, the reality on the ground was anything but. Expansion came with a price, paid not in gold, but in conflict, displacement, and cultural destruction. With the new territory secured, American settlers began flooding westward, driven by hopes of fertile farmland, personal freedom, and economic opportunity. They pushed into lands still inhabited by indigenous nations. The federal government followed, establishing forts, roads, and administrative posts to manage and enforce its new authority. This set the stage for a slow burning collision between two visions of the land, one that saw it as property to be claimed and improved, and another that saw it as a living entity to be shared and respected. Unsurprisingly, conflict erupted. Skirmishes turned into wars. Treaties were signed, then broken. And slowly, the frontier line moved further west, pushed by the force of rifles, railroads, and relentless ambition. But it wasn't just indigenous nations who paid a price. The Louisiana Territory also intensified a moral crisis that would eventually fracture the nation: slavery. Southern leaders immediately saw the vast new lands as an opportunity to expand plantation agriculture. Cotton and sugar thrived in the southern parts of the territory, and enslaved labor was seen as essential to making it profitable. This raised an explosive question: would slavery be allowed in the new territories? The answer would haunt Congress for decades. It led to the Missouri Compromise, sectional tensions, and eventually the Civil War. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just stretch America's borders. It stretched its political fabric to the breaking point, and there were environmental consequences too. The rivers were dammed, the plains plowed, the buffalo nearly wiped out. The transformation was rapid and irreversible. What had once been a landscape shaped by fire, herds, and indigenous stewardship became a patchwork of farms, fences, and industrial extraction. In seizing the land, the United States also inherited the burden of what it had done, a legacy that still echoes in debates over land rights, tribal sovereignty, and reparations. The land may have been purchased, but the real cost is still being paid. Once the ink dried on the Louisiana Purchase, a new question emerged. How exactly do you govern a territory so vast it defied imagination? The land stretched over what would become all or part of 15 modern US states, from Louisiana to Montana, and from the Dakotas to Colorado. But in 1803, it was an undefined wilderness full of possibilities, but with few roads, no towns, and countless competing claims. The first step was surveying, mapping out borders, rivers, mountains, and eventually property lines. Expeditions, like those led by Lewis and Clark, Zebulon Pike, and others laid the groundwork. Cartographers, land speculators, and military engineers followed, drawing maps that would slowly become county lines, reservations, and state borders. What had been an open and interconnected indigenous world was now being chopped into rectangles. Congress passed laws to organize the territory, first as military districts, then as organized territories, each with governors appointed by the federal government. These new administrative units followed the pattern established by the Northwest. Ordinance. Once a territory had enough settlers, it could apply for statehood, but not all borders were drawn with logic or justice. Take the creation of Missouri in 1821, the first state carved from the purchase. Its admission triggered national uproar because Missouri wanted to allow slavery. The resulting Missouri Compromise drew an imaginary line across the purchase. Slavery would be allowed south of it, banned to the north. That single line would haunt American politics for decades, as each new state status threatened to tip the balance between North and South. Meanwhile, white settlers poured into the new territories, often ahead of the law. They claimed land through preemption, squatting, and increasingly through federally sponsored land grants. Native peoples, even those with existing treaties, found their land suddenly reclassified, first as territory, then as open land, then as someone else's farm. And while maps were being filled in, they were also erasing native trails, erasing seasonal migrations, erasing indigenous names, and replacing them with names like Jefferson City, Baton Rouge, and Fort Pierre. Borders in this new vision of America weren't just lines on a map. They were tools of control, ways to claim, divide, sell, and govern land that just a few years earlier had belonged to no president, no state, and certainly no empire. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just reshape America's borders, it redefined its identity. With one diplomatic stroke, the United States went from a coastal republic hugging the Atlantic to a continental power stretching toward the unknown. It was the first great leap of manifest destiny even before the term existed, and it set the tone for the next century of expansion, conquest, and reinvention. Politically, the purchase established the precedent that the federal government could acquire new land through treaty, even without clear constitutional guidance. That precedent would be used again with Florida, Texas, Oregon, Alaska, and Hawaii. The US became not just a country, but a collector of territory, a nation always looking westward. Culturally, it fed a new kind of American myth, that of the frontier. The Louisiana Territory became the backdrop for stories of rugged settlers, daring explorers, and wide-open possibility. But for every pioneer's dream, there was a native nightmare. A memory of land lost, treaties broken, and people pushed further into exile. Economically, the impact was staggering. The Mississippi River became the artery of American commerce. Cities like St. Louis, New Orleans, and Kansas City grew into vital trade hubs. Fertile plains turned into farmland, and the discovery of gold, silver, and other natural resources would turn portions of the purchase into engines of industrial growth. But the deeper legacy is a contradiction. The purchase represented American ideals, opportunity, growth, independence, and yet it also embodied America's deepest failures: dispossession, slavery, imperial ambition. It's a story of triumph written on land taken from others, often violently. Today, the boundaries of the Louisiana Purchase define states that millions call home. Highways crisscross where buffalo once roamed. Fields of wheat now grow where sacred grounds once stood. And yet, beneath the soil and asphalt, the memory of that purchase still lingers, not just as a transaction, but as a turning point. The United States was forever changed by it. So was the world. But the question remains, was the cost purely monetary? Or was it, as many would later argue, measured in lives, cultures, and landscapes that could never be bought back? In the end, the Louisiana Purchase was more than a land deal. It was a defining moment, a shift in American identity from a fragile republic clinging to the eastern seaboard to an empire in the making, stretching boldly into the interior. The ink dried in Paris, but the consequences echoed across prairies, rivers, and generations. For the United States, it meant possibility. It sparked a new national confidence, a belief that expansion was not only desirable, but inevitable. That belief would harden into policy, becoming manifest destiny, and would eventually drive the US to the Pacific Ocean and beyond. It also cemented a model of power built on land acquisition, displacement, and development. The West was no longer a mystery, it was a target, and for settlers, speculators, and politicians, it was an open invitation to seize opportunity by uprooting what already existed. For native nations, the transformation was catastrophic. The land they had lived on, traded through, fought for, and honored was suddenly owned, not by an invading army, but by a distant government that claimed to have bought it. There were no negotiations, no consent, just a line on a map and a new set of rules. The arrival of American settlers accelerated cycles of violence, forced removals, and cultural devastation. Treaties came and went, reservations were drawn, bison were slaughtered, languages faded. By the time the dust settled, the native presence in the Louisiana Territory had been largely confined, silenced, or erased, though never extinguished. And yet, the legacy of the purchase remains layered. The cities, economies, and infrastructure that emerged from it helped shape the modern United States. The rivers it granted became lifelines. The natural resources it offered fueled industrial growth. The space it opened allowed for innovation, diversity, and reinvention. But the shadow of that deal still lingers. The Louisiana Purchase stands today as a paradox, a bold diplomatic victory, and a blueprint for displacement. It's a story of growth and grief, of ambition and amnesia. It made the United States what it is, but it also forced a reckoning that continues to this day. How do you celebrate a land you never truly asked for and can never truly return?